People have been asking for another anime review, so here we go. Future Diary, the most try-hard, edgy anime I've ever seen. Now, to get it out of the way, I just like to say I did like this show. I really liked it a lot, but it is try-hard edgy. They put so much time into trying to make this like as edgy and controversial and disturbing as possible. And it doesn't always necessarily fit in. Like, what do I mean by edgy? Just violence, and I don't have an issue with violence. I like violence, but it's just there's a lot of disfigurement and dismemberment and people getting their throats cut and people getting their heads chopped off. It's just very explicit. And a lot of the time it just feels like it was put in to just kind of shock people. And there's numerous rape scenes and like nudity and just kind of all this other really weird, creepy stuff. And like I said, like there's multiple gang rape scenes, which I think says something. And once again, I'm not a Puritan. Like I'm okay with this stuff being in my fiction. I'm just saying, for good or bad, I think they put a lot of this in to try to shock people and to try to like what a twist. Like oh, this character was actually evil the whole time because they got gang raped when they were younger, and just stuff like that. And it just felt like they were doing a lot of things like that. And you can like that or dislike that. To me, it's a bit like the last half of Game of Thrones, where they ran out of book content and they just started shoving really edgy stuff in, like Sansa getting raped, or like Duran Martell getting killed, or just things like that. So once again, you can like this or dislike this. I thought they went a little far, and I thought it made the show kind of tonally weird in a lot of cases. So what's the plot? The plot is kind of interesting. It reminds me a bit of Code Geass, in that most of the characters leave very little up to chance. Everybody pretty much enters battle with a plan in place based on their abilities. So it kind of reminds me a lot in Code Geass how Lelouch always has a master plan that's dependent upon his Geass, and then the other characters with them also have a similar plan based on theirs. And it's very much kind of, I know the term is overused, but a chess match between them. And this is very similar. So the plot is Deus, the god of space and time. I find the Japanese don't really understand the Western concept of God with an uppercase G, just probably because they're Shinto, and they don't have really the conception of an all-powerful creator god. So they kind of use Deus interchangeably as the god of space and time, or just God with an uppercase G. So for whatever reason, after uncounted millennia, Deus, the god of space and time, is dying. Now, he was the childhood imaginary friend, which is never really explored, of the main character, Yuki, and he decides that the one who succeeds him will be the one who wins the Future Diary contest. So 12 contestants are given Future Diaries, which all have different characteristics based on their personalities. So, for example, one of them who's a police officer, his diary, and the diaries are on phones with the exception of, I think, one or two. The leader of the cult has one on a scroll, which is kind of interesting. But it displays text information based on whatever the specific power is. Yuki, for instance, is very introverted but very observant, so his diary displays what's happening around him but doesn't refer to anything regarding himself. Yuno is obsessed with Yuki because she's a yandere, so her diary describes everything Yuki is doing. There's a police chief where it describes everything related to a case. There's a terrorist. I'm not bothering to use their names just so you won't get confused and I won't get confused. Whose diary tells her how to escape from any situation. And so kind of using these different powers and the different abilities, you have the various characters trying to take advantage of what the weak points of the other people's diaries are while exploiting their stronger ones. And you have various alliances that appear and disappear throughout the series, etc. And it is interesting from that standpoint. It's a much smarter anime than a lot of other ones I've seen, at least with regards to how the action works out. I like it that they have these magical elements, but they actually use them in kind of, not really a realistic, I don't know if realistic's the right term, but like in a practical way. Like, if you had these abilities rather than, I don't know, just what they do in some animes, like they just don't really make proper use of them, the characters are all very aware of the strengths and weaknesses of their abilities and are able to kind of and actually leverage them very well. Like I said, very little is left up to chance in these and everybody normally enters a situation with some sort of plan in mind. That is to counter their opponents and to help themselves. So there's a contest, and whoever's the last one standing will inherit the throne of space and time and become the new Deus. Now, Deus is convinced Yuki, the main character, will win no matter what, whereas his sidekick thinks that the second place will win. And it kind of differs throughout the series as to who is up and who is down. And I think one of the interesting elements of it is most of the diary holders are not necessarily bad people. Like, Yuki, the main character, isn't really a bad person. I find him really annoying. I've seen people compare him to Shinji Ikari, but I think Shinji's a much better person and a much braver person than Yuki is. Because at the end of the day, like, people call Shinji a wimp, people call him a loser, but he did get in the robot and he did fight to defend humanity. And at the end of the day, when we reach episode 24, he's the only Eva pilot who's still functional. Whereas Yuki just kind of cries like a bitch the entire series. And once again, I'm sympathetic to the plight he's found himself in. But when he finally decides to do something, he just kind of goes full crazy. So Yuki's kind of annoying. The second character, I don't really know what to make of her. I don't think I've really seen anything that has the yandere in it before, but she's like an extreme yandere. So she's completely obsessed with Yuki to at one point she kidnaps him and drugs him and holds him in like an abandoned city to prevent him from being killed by the other diary users because she loves him so much. And she just kills anybody who basically talks to Yuki. So I don't find her particularly sympathetic. I find like she goes through periods where she's relatively normal and you start to like her and you start to kind of root for them. And then she just becomes a complete psychopath and ceases to be sympathetic at all. Like if we look at the other characters, one of them is a woman who runs an orphanage and she uses her future diary to try to help her kids out. Both the kids who were raised and are now adults and the current kids. And that's kind of her motivation, is to try to help them out and improve their lives. So she has a very humanitarian focus. The detective or the police chief who initially gets one, he has no desire to become God. What he wants to do is he wants to just use his future diary to help him solve cases. And he wants to take out the members of the game who are like sociopaths or are using their diaries for evil. And he eventually tries to kill the protagonist, but there's a reason for it. He wants to try to save his son who has a terminal illness, and he believes if he becomes the god of space and time, he'll be able to save him. So once again, not necessarily a bad person. There's two lovers who are both very sympathetic, who are jointly one of the diary holders, and they aren't necessarily bad people. They're a little rough around the edges, but they just kind of want to survive so they can be together forever as the joint gods of space and time. And you kind of go through it, and a lot of the people aren't necessarily bad. A lot of them are crazy and kind of deranged, but deep down, there's been something traumatic that happened to them that kind of broke them. And with the exception of maybe the mayor, there isn't really a mustache-twirling villain. At least not to the same extent as a lot of other animes. So that's a very interesting perspective, because you have a lot of relatively sympathetic characters who are fighting each other, and you're not always sure who to root for. And I don't find Yuki particularly sympathetic, so I was often kind of rooting for some of the other characters throughout the series. So that's kind of the basic premise. Like I said, it's very edgy. A lot of the series revolves around the relationship between Yuki and Yuno. Yuno is a girl in Yuki's class who he had a bit of a crush on, and she turns out to be obsessively in love with him. And he's just never sure how to react to it. Because on one level, there's this pretty girl who's suddenly interested in him, and he kind of likes that. On the other hand, she stalks him, spies on him. She kidnaps him. She kills innocent people to try to help him. All that kind of stuff. So he feels very conflicted. And once again, I find it a bit hit or miss. Sometimes I really like the relationship. Sometimes I really hate it. I find the series can sometimes be a bit dependent upon, ironically enough, Deus Ex Machinas to try to keep the plot moving. And I mean, that is actually explained. There is a character whose point is basically to keep the game moving in case that something happens. But sometimes it feels a little contrived. And kind of it's interesting because at the beginning, a lot of the people have no desire to become the god of space and time. Yuki certainly doesn't. But as time goes on, the belief is if you can become the god of space and time, you can revive the dead. So once Yuki kind of decides that he's going to win, he starts keeping a list of all the people that he's going to bring back from the dead. And it's kind of, you have this interesting element of, I guess you could say, utilitarian versus categorical ethics or something to that effect. Because in a sense, this is the battle for who will become the strongest being in the universe. And if you have to step up a pile of bodies to get there, to ensure that someone who's fairly decent is able to get to that position, isn't it worth any number of sacrifices? If no one wins the game, then the world ends. And once again, if someone basically decent receives ultimate power, they can make the world an Eden. Whereas if someone who's evil or indifferent wins, then the world and the universe can just kind of fall apart under their inept rule. So it's interesting. There's a lot of very difficult moral challenges people face in the series. It's a lot smarter than a lot of animes I've seen. So I really liked it. But like I said, I think there's an over-reliance on being try-hard edgy, of trying to be shocking. And that sometimes works and it sometimes fails, and it can be a bit much. But yeah, overall, I'd recommend Future Diary. The dub's pretty good. I generally only watch dubs anyways. There we go, I just lost half of my subscribers. But no, it's a good anime. I definitely recommend it. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, this is Arjun. We must ascend.